Good morning. My name is Jeanne Kaliszewski. I'm an Episcopal priest serving as Curate at Grace Memorial Episcopal Church in Portland, Oregon, and I am delighted to be here with you this morning. What a strange and wonderful world we live in that I can go on retreat with you good people in Indiana, a couple thousand miles away, having never met you. So anyway, I am delighted to be here, and I want to thank the Reverend Phil Hooper for inviting me to collaborate with him and with you in this retreat and exploration on Jesus's parables. So thank you for having me. This morning, I'm going to spend a little bit of time with you all digging into a couple parables of Jesus, using a specific approach or frame based on an article that Phil shared with me early on when we started talking about this retreat. And the frame suggested by this author is specifically offered in opposition, or maybe not opposition, but as an alternative to a couple traditional ways in which parables of Jesus and Scripture in general have been interpreted in the past. The author argues that a couple of these approaches tend to be fairly limiting in terms of how we engage with Jesus's parables. The first sort of traditional approach that I know I've encountered in many a sermon and commentary is an allegorical approach to parables. That is mapping characters or images within the parable onto specific characters or concepts or members of the Trinity, and sort of deriving meaning from Jesus's parables in that way. The sort of most sort of familiar example I have of that is with the parable of the prodigal son, in which I have read many a commentary that argues that the father in that parable is Jesus, and then goes on to argue problematically that the son might be considered the people of Israel or the Jewish people who are caught up in some sort of culture of concern over ritual purity, and that are called back into the sort of this generous, grace-filled love of Jesus. And that's problematic for a couple of reasons, right? The first of which is the anti-Jewishness of that approach. Now, allegory isn't always something that leads to anti-Judaism, but it easily does and has in the history of our church and in the history of interpretation of Scripture. So that's something to be aware of and wary of. And the second reason why this author argues, and I would agree, allegory is less than helpful in looking at the parables of Jesus, is that it's quite limiting, right? So if we say that this character maps onto this member of the Trinity, it sort of reduces the parables, which are these wonderful and strange stories, into kind of a formula or a riddle to be worked out. And it sort of creates one interpretation of those parables. So that's the first approach that this author suggests that we might want to consider an alternative to. The second approach is one that actually can be quite helpful, and I'll talk a little bit about that later, which is the historical critical approach, which is looking at the parables specifically within the context of the culture and history of the people who would have been listening to Jesus at the time. And again, that actually can be quite helpful in helping us understand maybe some of the choices of imagery that Jesus uses in his parables, and understand how those would have been heard culturally or politically at the time. But again, I think that the tricky part of that is it does seem to limit the ways in which we engage Jesus's parables to a specific time and place. And sort of clamps down on the ways in which the parables themselves might speak to us in our hearts and in this time that we are in now. So the way the author of the article suggests we might engage with the parables, and the way I'm going to offer to you this morning, is to use a frame of what he describes as the sort of realism and strangeness intrinsic in these parables of Jesus, and that there's sort of a tension in the realism, and I would suggest not only realism, but sort of familiarity or ordinariness of the stories that Jesus offers, or the images that he offers. And then there's this kind of strangeness that when you dig into these parables comes to light. And that strangeness is the thing that I think we're supposed to be paying attention to. I would suggest that Jesus's parables are less about teaching and the way we think about teaching these days, that we sit at a desk and someone who knows more than we sort of shares their knowledge with us. I would suggest that Jesus's parables then and Jesus's parables now are meant to be a path to conversion, to metanoia, in that sense, that great Greek word of a turning around, and that the strangeness is what catches us, surprises us, and causes us to sort of look at the world, look at God, look at Christ in a new way, and that might engage our hearts into a kind of path of that turning around, of conversion that happens all the time, right? And so I appreciated that frame that the author offered, and we're going to walk through a couple parables together and use that frame and see what comes up. So the first parable, both parables actually come from the 13th chapter of the Gospel of Matthew. These parables are all in the synoptics, but we're going to use Matthew's version, and it's the parable of the mustard seed and the parable of the leaven. And these two parables are offered in succession in the 13th chapter of Matthew. And some commentators and scholars would argue are meant to be read together. And I do think they make a nice pair for us to explore today, so we're going to do that. So the first is the the parable of the mustard seed, which is quite familiar to, I imagine, all of us. And in fact, in the world in general, I've actually even been to a bar called the Mustard Seed, and have encountered many a church thrift shop called the Mustard Seed, right? So this is a very familiar story to many of us. But let's take a listen again and kind of bring what I would suggest is sort of a beginner's mind to it, and try to let go of those visions of bars and thrift shops and maybe past sermons that we've heard, and engage with this together. So I'll read this. This is from the NRSV version from the 13th chapter of Matthew, starting with verse 31. Jesus put before the crowds another parable. The kingdom of heaven is like a mustard seed that someone took and sowed in his field. It is the smallest of all the seeds, but when it has grown, it is the greatest of shrubs and becomes a tree, so that the birds of the air come and make nests in its branches. So, familiar, right? And actually familiar not just because we've heard it before, but a familiar image that is sort of, present in the world all around us. We can look out our window maybe perhaps and see evidence of something that was planted as a seed and that grew into something bigger, right? And so it feels pretty, straightforward. But I will say, my friends, that usually, for me at least, when I think something that Jesus is teaching is straightforward, that's often a clue to me that I need to take another pass at it, because very rarely is it as straightforward as it seems. But it's a very sort of realistic, ordinary, familiar sort of image, right? We plant a seed, it grows, it becomes something bigger. But when we dig into the images that Jesus offers, there is some strangeness at play underneath the surface, if you will, underneath the sort of ground, if we dig into it a little bit. And the first bit of strangeness that I would suggest is intrinsic in this parable is the choice of a mustard seed to start with, right? Well, there is some debate or dispute amongst scholars how to characterize a mustard seed. Some would, I've seen it called a noxious weed. Others remark that this is certainly something that would have been planted and cultivated at the time of Jesus. The choice of a mustard seed to be planted and used as an image for the kingdom of heaven does seem a strange one. It's not a plant that you would plant in your fields because you want to make money. It's not a plant that you would plant in your fields because you want to feed your family or people around you. And so it does seem like an odd, slightly strange choice to represent the kingdom of heaven. Whether or not it's a weed, it's certainly not a core sort of crop that someone would plant with care in their fields. The second bit of strangeness I would suggest might be sort of intrinsic in this parable is the pattern of growth that Jesus talks about. So he talks about the seed being planted and it grows and it becomes the greatest of shrubs, which seems strangely qualified superlative. I mean, a shrub is not something that we would normally consider large in any stretch of the imagination. And a mustard seed indeed only grows to be about a foot, maybe a foot and a half tall. So even if it were the greatest of all the mustard seed shrubs ever grown, maybe 2 feet tall. But Jesus doesn't stop there, right? He goes on to say, and it grows into a tree, and it becomes a tree that the birds of the air make their nests in. And that is strange indeed, that sort of explosive, extravagant growth that Jesus is describing from this small seed is the strangeness of this story. And that makes sense, I think, given how a lot of Jesus's parables progress. The French philosopher Paul Ricoeur wrote a short article that I read not too long ago that talked about extravagance as the sort of means of disorientation that Jesus often uses in his parables. And this extravagant growth that comes from this tiny seed is something more or stranger than just something small gets big, but something small becomes enormous, abundant, and something that's not even meant to be in the first place, right? So the mustard seed. The second parable that I thought we might spend a little bit of time with is the parable of the leaven, and this comes right after the parable of the mustard seed in the Gospel of Matthew. And I will read that out loud to you. This one maybe is a little less familiar, at least in the world in general, and to folks in particular who study the Bible. Anyway, so here we go, the parable of the leaven. He told them another parable. The kingdom of heaven is like yeast that a woman took and mixed in with 3 measures of flour until all of it was leavened. Again, another very familiar, sort of ordinary image, a woman baking bread, mixing yeast into flour so that it'll rise when she bakes it. So it feels pretty straightforward. Again, I think it's easy to sort of think, okay, well, yeast is like a seed, right? It's this small thing that has this explosive growth and results in something new and perhaps delicious. And that's actually a really lovely way to think about this parable. But again, I think if we dig into some of the strangeness intrinsic in this parable, we gain maybe a little different insight into maybe what Jesus was trying to teach and preach and convert about when talking about the kingdom of heaven. So the first interesting, sort of strange moment or image in this parable is the choice of the verb mixed. And that's the NRSV translates it as mix. The woman mixed the yeast into the flour. But if you look at the Greek, and I'm going to look at my notes because I can't really say it, the Greek word is enekrypson, and enekrypson can be translated as mixed, but actually a better translation is hid. And we get the word encryption from this Greek word enekrypson, right? And so a perhaps better, or at least stranger, translation of this parable is that the woman hid yeast in 3 measures of flour. That's a different sort of strange image, right? Why would the kingdom of heaven be hid? Why would a woman hide yeast in flour? So that's the first sort of strange thing to sort of let kind of sit in our hearts a little bit. The second strange sort of image in this parable is 3 measures of flour. And again, this is actually where that kind of historical critical piece comes in, because if we read this from our vantage point, we might imagine 3 measures of flour is like 3 cups of flour. But 3 measures of flour is actually like 60 pounds of flour. So this is an enormous amount of flour. And again, we're encountering at the end of this parable this sort of image of abundance, of extravagance in the amount of flour that this woman is hiding the yeast in. Something also interesting that we might pay attention to is that use of that specific term of 3 measures of flour. The New Testament scholar Amy Jill Leaven suggests that we might also look at a story from earlier in our tradition, from the book of Genesis, that also uses this image of 3 measures of flour. And it's the story when the 3 strangers show up at the tent of Abraham and Sarah. And Abraham welcomes them in and asks Sarah to prepare a meal for them, prepare food for them, offer hospitality. And he suggests that she go, or probably doesn't suggest, tells her to go and get 3 measures of flour. Again, an extraordinary amount of flour for these visitors, 60 pounds of flour to feed these strangers who have arrived at their tent. And what's interesting about that story is it ends with this extraordinary act of generosity in response by God. And Sarah becomes pregnant in her elderly years, becomes pregnant with Isaac, and that is where she learns of her pregnancy. So this image of 3 measures of flour not only is one of just an abundant amount of flour, but actually harkens back to another story in which God's extraordinary generosity is offered to Sarah and Abraham in response to the hospitality and generosity they offered to the strangers who appeared at their tent door. So I might suggest to you all, as we encounter these parables of Jesus, we dig a little bit into the sort of strange abundance that is offered to us as images by Jesus in these stories, in these teachings. And also, I might suggest that there's a strangeness in the very ordinariness of these stories themselves and the familiarity of them. To my mind, at least off the top of my head, I can think of no parable of Jesus in which the image or the context or the story that Jesus tells is something that is not familiar and relatable, right? Families that are arguing, people seeking justice, people gardening or harvesting from their fields, right? These are all stories and images taken from ordinary scenes of ordinary life. And at least to me, that's something sort of strange and interesting, right? Jesus doesn't use parables with these sort of supernatural images or strange, fantastical occurrences, but things that come from the world around us, things that come from our own lives, images and stories and contexts that are familiar to us. And the strangeness in that is perhaps that we are called to encounter the kingdom of heaven, encounter Christ, encounter God's inbreaking in the world as it is now, in the world around us, in the fields, in our gardens, in our own backyards, and that anytime we encounter a surprising abundance, at least in the context of these 2 parables, it might be a hint of God's kingdom breaking into the world. I just wanted to share a story about something like that happened in my own life in the past few months. So right after George Floyd was murdered, there were a number, and continue to be, but a number of very large protests in my city. And my eldest daughter wanted to participate, but is quite anxious about crowds in general, and in the time of COVID did not feel comfortable going and demonstrating and protesting with thousands of people. So we talked about some way that she might participate in what was going on. And I suggested, or we came up with the idea of her showing up and offering water or food to the people who were protesting. So we went to Trader Joe's and we bought a couple cases of bottled water, and we bought some trail mix and some granola bars, and we put them in the back of her car, and we drove over to the park where people were showing up. And she opened the back of her car and started giving out some of these things. And this extraordinary thing happened. People came up to her and started giving her water, giving her food to pass out, giving her tarps for people, giving her umbrellas in case it rained, giving her all these things that she could in turn offer to the people who were showing up to protest. And in fact, she ended up getting so much given to her that we ended up taking it to the church where I work that offers a Friday night takeaway meal to people who need a meal on Friday nights. And all that water and all those granola bars and even the tarps and the umbrellas were handed out by the good folks at my church to folks who needed them, people who were living outside or didn't have a lot of food security or housing security. And so it was this really wonderful example of God's abundance, extravagance, generosity breaking into the world, much the same way a mustard seed grows into a tree where yeast is hidden into an enormous amount of flour and feeds so many. And so the strangeness of these parables lies perhaps not only in the sort of surprising twist of extravagance that comes in, but also in the ways we encounter the kingdom of heaven breaking in our own lives, in the world in so many ways. Anytime we encounter an abundance of love, of justice, of freedom, of grace and mercy, that is a reminder of these parables. And I would encourage y'all to continue to look around, not only in scripture, but look around in the world and in these very ordinary, familiar places. Pay attention to the strange and beautiful abundance that God is offering to us in these stories and to us in the world. Thank you for this time. Thanks for sharing this few minutes with me, and God bless you all in your lives, in your families. May you stay healthy and well, and perhaps one day we will actually meet in person. Thank you very much. Take care. Bye-bye.